I had a bit of an epiphany when I was watching Angry Joe cover the Game Awards nominees. I don't know if I said this during my reaction stream. I did one right away, but I was bringing this up like over and over and over again. I was alluding to it, right? Wow, this guy does not want Nintendo to win any Game Awards, right? There was no talk of like any Nintendo games he liked. He was dismissive of Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder and the Mario movie. Everything Nintendo related was like laughed at or ignored. And to me, I think that kind of demonstrates like where we're at in gaming culture right now. It's interesting thinking like going into the Game Award season, seeing like Nintendo have such a strong 2023 and seeing like the reality of what's happening with the reception of Tears of the Kingdom, of Mario Wonder, of everything. And I'm really starting to understand that I honestly really, really understate how biased the industry is against Nintendo because forget about the Game of the Year awards, right? Forget about like the awards, forget about the categories, forget about like what's going on here, okay? Like forget like all the controversies, forget like the arguments. Okay. Tears of the Kingdom, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, right? Are they good games? Okay. Obviously, to anyone who's like played them or knows anything about them at all, yes, of course they're good games, right? They are fun to play. They're interesting. They innovate a lot. They are really really popular. They've sold a ton. Great like critical reception. Like they have been successful in any by every stretch, every metric that you can possibly think of, right? Why exactly is the community getting hung up over the Game of the Year awards, right? Like when you look at the reception to like Game of the Year, like you're seeing so many people just bleed on about how like, oh, Baldur's Gate, it's gonna win. Like, forget about that for like. Even if Baldur's Gate 3 was the best game ever made, even if it did win Game of the Year, how exactly does that invalidate Zelda from existing, right? How exactly does that invalidate Super Mario Bros. Wonder? Like, when you look at it objectively, like, wouldn't it be a good thing that we get multiple great games a year from like a wide variety of different developers? Like, isn't it incredible how everyone is just willing to throw up their hands and say that like Tears of the Kingdom doesn't matter at all, that it's not talked about, that it's not popular, that it only sold 20 million units. Like, isn't it bizarre? Like the lengths people will go to avoid addressing the obvious. That like, regardless of how well it sold, regardless of how well the Metacritic score did, regardless of what the fans think, the game is objectively good, right? Same with Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Like whether you think that like it's better than the old games or not, like whatever you think of the franchise as a whole, or like everything else that came out this year, like where you would stack it up against everything else, like there is no denying that the game is good. And that is the problem I have going into the Game Awards. Like I've realized this by looking at the commentary from like 4chan and YouTube shills and like the community, like no matter who wins or for whatever reason, like you cannot take that away from Nintendo, right? Like I think a lot of people really have this mindset that like if Baldur's Gate 3 wins, that'll somehow like invalidate Nintendo, that like it'll be some epic L for the company. But they're still selling games. They're still leading the market. They're still like they still have like everything coming out in 2024. Like realistically, how long is it for us to get like Baldur's Gate 4? Like what, 5 years? Probably. It's probably going to be more ambitious than the last. Like it'll probably have a ton of problems considering like how common it is for these RPGs to just kind of blow up and then just kind of implode, right? It happened with Mass Effect, it happened with The Witcher, it happened with Dragon Age, it happened with all this stuff, right? Like realistically, how is Larian gonna compete with Nintendo like long term, right? Even in this Game of the Year ceremony, they objectively are not the developer of the year because Nintendo has two Game of the Year nominees, right? They have different games in different categories that are popular. Stuff like Pikmin 4, Fire Emblem Engage, Cereza and the Lost Demon. Like they have a lot of stuff that came out this year that's just fantastic, right? And just because other games have sold more or were better received by critics or by fans, that doesn't somehow invalidate them. I've been really surprised at how much fun I've been having playing games like Detective Pikachu Returns or WarioWare Move It or Super Mario RPG, games that like nobody's really talking about going into Game of the Year season. And I think that really demonstrates just how meaningless the Game Awards actually are. Where like a significant chunk of my favorite games this year are games that aren't really being talked about in the community at all. Right? Like it's not because they're bad games and they didn't do well. Not necessarily. It's just that they're not the kind of games that are going to succeed at the Game Awards. And that is perfectly fine. It does not invalidate these games from existing if they don't get nominated or like nobody even really cares and they're not there, right? Conversely, just because a game is nominated for the Game Awards, it does not necessarily make it good, interesting, or exciting. See Alan Wake 2, Baldur's Gate 3, Resident Evil 4, Spider-Man 2. Like, it's crazy seeing how much Spider-Man 2 has fallen off already. But, like, basically, I think people really are obsessed with downplaying everything Nintendo does, like attacking everything Nintendo does. Like if they weren't propping up Baldur's Gate 3 in an attempt to take down Nintendo this year, it would be something else. They would have clung on to Starfield or Diablo 4 or Final Fantasy 16 or something, right? They would have like done anything to avoid having to admit that Nintendo put out good games this year. And we've seen this happen, time and time again over the past several years. Like Breath of the Wild, right? The game that everybody is saying that was way better than Tears of the Kingdom at the moment. That was reviled when it first came out. I remember just like the insane controversies regarding it, like regarding the visuals and the content and like what you do in the game and the story, the voice acting. Like, you know, even today, you can still find some people like regurgitating nonsense about like weapon durability or whatever. I feel as if the I feel as if the community just doesn't. Uh, it isn't. The online gaming community is unreliable. Like for too long, all we've seen talked about are just like these these million sellers and these award bait games. Nobody really talks about like the games and their actual merits, like how what game is good for in what genre, like developers to keep an eye on, indie projects from promising new indie studios. Like nobody really talks about any of that. Like it does kind of feel like in a lot of ways like mainstream gaming discourse is just about pretending as if PC, Xbox, and PlayStation are better than Nintendo. That's basically what like these ceremonies make me how they make me feel is just looking at how much nonsense is being propped up against legitimately good games, right? I I don't really. I've been disavowing the Game Awards for years now, right? People who think it's a recent thing really need to get a reality check. I've always been critical of these shows, how they've run, how they've conducted themselves, but more and more I feel like people are starting to use them to validate their extreme hatred and contempt for Nintendo, right? It's appalling, and I hope that more people start noticing and addressing these kinds of problems.